The wind screamed across the Nebraska plains like the voice of winter itself, carrying with it the promise of death. In an abandoned soddy 20 miles from nowhere, Rebecca Morrison pressed her back against the earthen wall and felt her world contract to nothing but pain, cold, and the terrible certainty that she would die alone. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days now, and the contractions had started with the storm's fury. Outside, snow piled against the single window until only darkness remained. Inside, by the dying light of her last candle, she whispered prayers to a God who seemed as distant as the nearest town. She had no way of knowing that salvation rode through that same merciless storm on an Indian pony, guided by eyes that could read the land's secrets even when the world turned white with rage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pain came in waves now, each one stealing her breath and replacing it with something primal and desperate. Rebecca Morrison had been alone in the soddy for 6 days when the first snowflakes began to fall, and she had watched through the single glass pane as the world outside transformed from brown prairie grass to an endless expanse of white death. Her husband Thomas had ridden to Ogallala for supplies and the doctor who had promised to come when her time arrived. That was 2 weeks ago. The baby wasn't supposed to come until Christmas, but winter and childbirth followed their own calendars, indifferent to human plans. The soddy was little more than a cave carved from the hillside, its walls lined with prairie sod and its roof supported by cottonwood beams that Thomas had dragged from the creek bottom. A cast-iron stove squatted in one corner, cold now because she had burned the last of the buffalo chips yesterday. The wind found every crack and crevice, sending icy fingers through the spaces between the sod blocks. Her breath came out in white, puffs that dissolved in the dim light of the tallow candle flickering on the rough-hewn table. She had tried to prepare. The quilts were laid out on the bed Thomas had built from shipping crates and hemp rope. Clean rags waited in a basin beside, a pitcher of water that had frozen solid during the night. She had boiled the scissors and thread before the fire died, following the instructions from the medical book her sister had pressed into her hands back in Ohio. But the book said nothing about being alone when the time came. It said nothing about blizzards that turned the world into a tomb of ice and wind. The contractions had started as a dull ache in her lower back while she was trying to coax heat from the dying embers in the stove. At first, she thought it was just the cold settling into her bones, the way it had every night since the temperature dropped. But the ache spread and intensified, wrapping around her middle like an iron band that tightened and released with mechanical precision. She had felt this before, months ago, when she lost the first baby. But this was different, stronger, more insistent. She tried to time them by counting between the wind gusts, but the storm was constant now, a howling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Through the window, she could see nothing but white. Chaos. The barn where Thomas kept their 2 horses was invisible, though it stood only 50 yards from the soddy door. Everything beyond the immediate circle of candlelight might as well have existed on another planet. When the next wave of pain hit, Rebecca doubled over and gripped the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles went white. The candle flame danced wildly in the moving air, casting shifting shadows on the earthen walls. She tried to remember her mother's voice, the stories of her own birth and the births of her 4 siblings. Women had been doing this since the beginning of time, her mother had said. Bodies knew what to do, but her mother had never done it alone in a hole in the ground while winter tried to claw its way inside. The wind changed pitch, rising to a shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the soddy. Snow began to drift through a gap near the door where the leather hinges had shrunk in the cold. She watched it accumulate in a small pile on the packed earth floor, each flake catching, the candlelight for an instant before joining the growing mound. The temperature inside was dropping. She could feel it in the way her breath hung in the air longer, in the way the pain seemed to cut deeper through the cold that was settling into her bones. She struggled to her feet and waddled to the bed, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other supporting her swollen belly. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the chaos outside. Or maybe it was responding to her fear. The midwife back in Zanesville had told her that babies could feel their mother's emotions. If that was true, then this child was absorbing pure terror. Lying down brought no relief. The contractions came closer together now, each one building to a crescendo that left her gasping and shaking. She tried to find a comfortable position, but there was none. On her side, the baby seemed to press against her ribs. On her back, the weight made it hard to breathe. She settled for a half-sitting position, propped against the pillows Thomas had sewn from flour sacks and stuffed with prairie grass. The candle had burned down to a stub, its flame wavering in the draught that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She had 3 more candles, but after that only darkness. The thought of giving birth in complete darkness sent a wave of panic through her that had nothing to do with the contractions. She had always been afraid of the dark, ever since childhood, when her older brother had locked her in the root cellar as a prank. The memory of that suffocating blackness made her chest tight with anxiety. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the others, and she heard herself make a sound that was part gasp, part moan. It echoed strangely in the small space, coming back to her from the curved walls, like the voice of someone else, someone she didn't recognize. The pain reached its peak, and then slowly receded, leaving her panting and dizzy. When she looked down, she saw a dark stain spreading across the front of her dress. Her water had broken. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was happening, now, tonight, and she was going to face it alone. There would be no doctor with his leather bag and confident hands, no midwife with her store of wisdom and gentle encouragement, no Thomas to hold her hand and whisper that everything would be all right. Just her and the baby, and the storm that seemed determined to bury them both under an avalanche of ice and snow. She tried to stand, thinking she should change into the clean nightgown she had laid out for the occasion, but another contraction doubled her over before she could take a step. This one was different, harder, more urgent. When it passed, she realized she was making a sound deep in her throat, a low humming that seemed to come from some primitive part of her brain. She had heard cows make similar sounds during difficult births. The thought should have embarrassed her, but instead it was oddly comforting. She was not the first creature to face this alone. The wind hammered against the soddy with renewed fury, and she heard something crack overhead. One of the roof beams, maybe, stressed beyond its limit by the weight of accumulating snow. If the roof collapsed, it would be over quickly. The thought was not entirely unwelcome. Better to die crushed than to freeze slowly or bleed to death in childbirth. Better than watching her baby die in her arms because she didn't know how to help it breathe or keep it warm. She forced the dark thoughts away and tried to focus on the practical matters. The basin of water was frozen, but she could melt it with the heat from the candle flame. It would take hours, but what else did she have? Time stretched out before her like the endless prairie, marked only by the rhythm of contractions that came closer and closer together. She could feel the baby moving lower, pressing against parts of her body that seemed to expand and shift to accommodate its passage. The sensation was alien and frightening, as if her own flesh had become something she no longer controlled. The candle sputtered and nearly went out, saved only by a momentary lull in the wind. Rebecca watched the flame dance and wondered how many women throughout history had faced this same moment of absolute vulnerability. Pioneer wives on lonely homesteads, Indian women hide lodges, slave women in plantation quarters, all of them are connected by this common thread of pain and fear and desperate hope. The thought made her feel less alone, even as the wind howled its reminder that she was the only human soul for miles in any direction. She reached for the medical book, thinking it might contain some forgotten piece of advice that would help her through the next few hours. But when she tried to focus on the words, they swam together in the flickering light. The contractions were coming so frequently now that she barely had time to catch her breath between them. Each one seemed to push her further from the world of books and rational thought into something more primitive and essential. A place where words meant nothing and only instinct mattered. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of a living thing, piling snow against the walls until the soddy felt like a burial mound. Inside, Rebecca Morrison prepared to bring new life into a world that seemed bent on extinguishing it before it could draw its first breath. She closed her eyes and tried to remember how to pray, but all that came out was that low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through her bones and into the frozen earth beneath her. Somewhere in the howling wilderness, she did not know that help was coming. She could not see the figure moving through the blizzard like a ghost, guided by instincts older than maps or compass bearings. She could not hear the soft footfalls of an unshod pony picking its way through drifts that would have swallowed a shod horse. She knew nothing of the eyes that could read the shape of the land, even in the white chaos of the storm, or the hands that could find shelter where others saw only death. All she knew was pain and cold, and the terrible certainty that she would face whatever came next alone. The candle burned lower, its pool of light shrinking until it illuminated only her hands and the growing stain on her dress. Beyond that circle of warmth, darkness pressed in like a living thing, patient and hungry, and absolutely certain of its victory. But Rebecca Morrison was tougher than she knew, forged by 2 years on the Nebraska frontier into something harder than the Ohio farm girl who had started this journey. And deep in her body, a new life stirred with its own fierce determination to enter the world, storm or no storm. The breaking point had arrived, and everything that came after would be different. The wind screamed its fury, and she screamed back. The first sound was so faint that Rebecca thought she had imagined it. A soft thud against the outer wall of the soddy, different from the constant drumming of wind and snow. She held her breath between contractions, straining to listen, but heard only the storm's relentless assault. Then it came again. 3 deliberate knocks, measured and patient, as if someone stood outside in the blizzard, waiting for an invitation to enter. Fear shot through her like lightning. No civilized person would be traveling in weather like this. Indians, maybe. Or worse, the stories Thomas had told her about the Comanche raids further south came flooding back. Warriors who could move like shadows across the landscape, appearing where least expected. She had seen the burned-out homesteads along their journey west, the scattered bones that spoke of violence too terrible to contemplate. Now, in her most vulnerable moment, something had found her isolated refuge. The knocking came a third time, more insistent now. Rebecca struggled to sit up straighter, her hand groping for the shotgun Thomas kept loaded beside the bed. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of the barrel, just as another contraction seized her, so powerful it drove all other thoughts from her mind. When the pain receded, she heard a new sound, a voice calling out in words she could not understand. The language was unlike anything she had ever heard. Not Spanish, which she knew from the Mexican traders who sometimes passed through their settlement. Not German or Norwegian like some of their neighbors spoke. This was something older, more guttural, with rhythms that seemed to match the wind itself. The voice was male, she was certain of that much. Deep and steady, without the panic she would have expected from someone caught in a blizzard. He called out again, and this time she caught something that might have been English mixed with the foreign words. Something that sounded like help or woman. The voice was closer now, just outside the door. She could hear movement, the scrape of boots against the frozen earth, the soft snort of a horse. Whoever this was, he had somehow managed to travel through conditions that would kill most men. Another contraction built inside her, and she bit down on her lower lip to keep from crying out. The pain was becoming unbearable, each wave stronger. Then the last. The baby was coming soon, whether she wanted it to or not. And now there was a stranger outside her door, someone whose intentions she could not guess. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. The voice came again, gentler this time, almost coaxing. She heard him moving around the soddy, perhaps looking for another way in or checking the stability of the structure. His footsteps were remarkably quiet for someone wearing boots in deep snow. When he spoke again, he was at the window, and she could see a dark shape pressed against the glass. The candlelight must have given him a clear view of her condition. The words came in broken English now, heavily accented but unmistakable. "Woman is sick. Need help. I help." The voice was patient, almost gentle, without the harsh edge she had expected. "Baby coming soon. I know this. Help, woman. Help, baby." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. How could he possibly know about the baby? The realization struck her like a physical blow. He could see her through the window, see her swollen belly and the obvious signs of labor. She was completely exposed, vulnerable in a way that went beyond mere physical danger. This stranger, this Indian warrior, could see her at her most helpless moment. But even as fear flooded through her, another part of her mind was calculating. She was going to die here alone if something didn't change. The baby was coming, and she had no idea how to deliver it safely. No knowledge of what to do if something went wrong, if the cord was wrapped around the neck, or if there was too much bleeding afterward. The medical book was useless now. Its neat diagrams and clinical language meaningless in the face of raw biological necessity. The man outside seemed to sense her hesitation. His voice came again, softer now, almost musical in its cadence. He was speaking in his own language, words that flowed like water over stones. She could not understand the meaning, but something in the tone was soothing. It reminded her of the way her mother had sung lullabies during thunderstorms, a wordless comfort against the chaos of nature. Then he switched back to English. "I am called Swift Arrow. Comanche. No medicine ways, no birth ways have helped before." A pause, and she could see his breath fogging the glass. "Woman die alone. Baby die alone. I help. No harm. Promise no harm." Swift Arrow, the name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She had heard that name before, whispered in the trading posts and settler meetings. A Comanche war chief who had fought the cavalry along the Texas border before the tribes were driven north. Stories of his raids, his tactical brilliance, his ruthless efficiency in battle, but also stories of his honor, his protection of women and children even during the worst conflicts. Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before, and she could not hold back the cry of pain. Through the window she saw the dark figure. "Move," heard him say something urgent in his own language. When the pain passed, she found herself looking directly into his eyes through the frost-covered glass. Even in the dim candlelight, they were remarkably clear, dark brown with flecks of gold that seemed to catch and hold the light. There was no menace in those eyes, no threat or calculation. Instead, she saw something that surprised her: concern. Professional assessment, the look of someone who had seen difficult births before and knew what signs to watch for. Despite everything she had been taught about his people, despite all the stories of savage brutality, those eyes belonged to someone who understood exactly what she was facing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Woman," he said again, his voice carrying clearly through the glass, "I come in now, help with baby, have medicine, have knowledge." He paused, seeming to search for the right words in English. "Trust swift arrow. Save woman. Save baby. This, I promise, on spirit of grandmother." The mention of his grandmother stirred something deep in Rebecca's memory. Her own grandmother had been a midwife in Ohio, delivering babies throughout the county until she was well into her 70s. She had often spoken of the sacred nature of birth, how it transcended all other concerns, race, religion, social standing. None of that mattered when a child was fighting to enter the world. All that mattered was preserving life, but trusting. This stranger meant opening her door to someone who could kill her as easily as help her. It meant allowing a Comanche warrior to see her at her most defenseless, to touch her with hands that had undoubtedly taken lives in battle. Every instinct screamed against it. Every story she had heard, every warning from soldiers and settlers, told her that this was how pioneer women died. Alone and far from help, trusting the wrong person at the wrong moment. Yet another part of her mind, the practical part that had kept her alive through 2 harsh winters on the frontier, was weighing the alternatives. She was going to die anyway, if nothing changed. The baby was coming now. She could feel the overwhelming urge to push the building inside her. Without help, without knowledge, without even basic supplies like hot water and clean cloth, both she and the child would likely perish before dawn. Swift Arrow seemed to sense her internal struggle. He pressed his hand against the glass, palm flat against the surface. "Woman, think hard," but the baby did not wait for thinking. "Baby, come soon. Need help now." His English was improving as he spoke, as if the urgency of the situation was sharpening his command of the language. "Swift Arrow, father of children, know what a woman feels, no fear. But know also what happens if no help comes." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. He was right. The baby would not wait for her to overcome her prejudices and fears. Nature followed its own schedule, indifferent to human concerns, about race and culture and the bitter history between their peoples. In this moment, trapped between contractions in a freezing soddy while a blizzard raged outside, such consideration seemed impossibly distant and abstract. She made her decision with the sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extremis. "The door," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's not locked." She let the shotgun slide from her nerveless fingers to the floor beside the bed. If Swift Arrow meant to harm her, the weapon would be useless anyway. She was in no condition to aim or fire, and he could overpower her without effort in her current state. She heard him move around to the front of the soddy, heard the creak of the leather hinges as the door swung open. Snow blew in with him, carried on a gust of wind so cold it seemed to freeze the very air in her lungs. He stepped inside quickly and pushed the door shut behind him, shutting out the worst of the storm. For a moment he stood silhouetted against the candlelight, a tall figure wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that made him seem even larger than he was. Rebecca's first clear look at Swift Arrow surprised her. She had expected war paint and feathers, the theatrical costume that Eastern newspapers associated with hostile Indians. Instead, she saw a man dressed for survival in the worst weather the plains could offer. His coat was beautifully crafted, with intricate beadwork along the shoulders, but its primary purpose was clearly practical. Beneath it, he wore buckskin leggings and a shirt that looked warm and well-made. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and decorated with small metal ornaments that caught the light when he moved. His face was lean and weathered, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind and snow. He was perhaps 35, maybe 40. It was hard to tell. What struck her most was his expression. There was no hostility there, no triumph at finding her helpless. Instead, she saw focused concern, the look of someone assessing a medical emergency. He moved with surprising quietness for such a large man, crossing the small space in 2 steps and kneeling beside the bed. His dark eyes swept over her with professional detachment, taking in her condition, the evidence of labor, the signs of distress. When he spoke, his voice was calm and reassuring. "Baby coming very soon," he said, pulling off his heavy mittens to reveal hands that were scarred but steady. "Swift arrow see many births, know what to do." He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw sincerity there that was impossible to fake. "Woman, trust now. Trust, swift arrow, help." Another contraction gripped her, and this time she could not hold back a scream. The pain was overwhelming, primitive, beyond anything she had ever experienced. Through it all, she felt Swift Arrow's hand on her forehead, cool and steady, while he spoke in his own language. The words meant nothing to her, but the tone was unmistakably soothing. When the contraction passed, she found herself looking into those steady, dark eyes. "Good," he said simply. "Baby ready now? Woman ready now?" He stood and began removing his coat, revealing the buckskin shirt beneath. The garment was decorated with porcupine quills and small pieces of shell that must have come from distant oceans. He moved with efficiency born of experience, hanging the coat on a peg by the door and rolling up his sleeves. From a leather pouch at his belt, he produced items that made Rebecca's eyes widen. Clean strips of sinew for tying off the cord. A small knife with a blade that gleamed like polished silver. Packets of dried herbs that filled the air with unfamiliar but not unpleasant scents when he opened them. Most surprising of all, a small bundle of what looked like soft doe-skin cloth, clearly prepared for wrapping a newborn. "How did you—" she began, but another contraction cut off her words. This one brought with it an overwhelming urge to push, a biological imperative that swept away all other concerns. She bore down instinctively, her body taking over the process with wisdom older than conscious thought. Swift Arrow positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his movements calm and confident. "Good," he said again. "Baby wants to come now, woman. And push when the body says push. Swift Arrow help baby into the world." His hands were warm when he examined her, gentle but sure. "Head coming now. See dark hair. Baby strong." The next few minutes passed in a blur of effort and encouragement. Swift Arrow guided her through each contraction, his voice steady and reassuring, even as he worked to help deliver the child. His English improved with each passing moment, as if the intensity of the situation was bringing back vocabulary he had not used in years. "Push now," he would say, or "rest now," or "good woman, very strong." Between contractions, he prepared for the baby's arrival, warming the doe-skin cloths with his breath and checking that everything was ready. His movements were economical and purposeful, without wasted motion or hesitation. When the baby's head finally crowned, Rebecca felt a moment of panic. The sensation was overwhelming, like being turned inside out. But Swift Arrow's voice cut through her fear. "See baby now," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "Beautiful child, very strong. One more push, woman. Just one more." She pushed with everything she had left, and suddenly the pressure was gone. She heard a thin cry, weak but unmistakably alive, and Swift Arrow's voice saying something in Comanche that sounded like a prayer of thanksgiving. When she looked down, she saw him holding her baby, a tiny red-faced creature that squirmed and complained about being expelled from its warm sanctuary. "Boy," Swift Arrow announced, with something that might have been pride. "Strong boy, good lungs." He was already cleaning the baby with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he cleared the child's mouth and nose. The baby's cries grew stronger, filling the small soddy with the sound of new life. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief rather than pain. Her son was alive, against all odds, in the middle of a killing blizzard, with only a stranger to help her. She had brought a living child into the world. The miracle of it was almost too much to comprehend. Swift Arrow finished cleaning the baby and wrapped him in the soft doeskin, then placed the bundle in Rebecca's arms. The child was warm and solid against her chest, his cries gradually subsiding as he felt the comfort of his mother's embrace. She looked down into a wrinkled face that was already beginning to show traces of the features he would grow into. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Swift Arrow through her tears. The words seemed inadequate for what he had done, but they were all she had. "Thank you for saving us." Swift Arrow smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Baby, save himself," he said. "Woman, save herself. Swift Arrow just help little bit." He was cleaning his hands with snow he had brought in from outside, his movements still careful and methodical. But work not finished. Must take care of woman. Now, must make sure bleeding stops, must keep warm. As if summoned by his words, the reality of her situation came flooding back. She was still lying in a freezing soddy in the middle of a blizzard, exhausted and vulnerable. The fire was dead, the food was gone, and Thomas would not return for days, even if the storm stopped immediately. She and her newborn son were entirely dependent on this Comanche warrior who had appeared out of nowhere like an answer to prayers she had not dared to speak. But as Swift Arrow moved around the small space, tending to practical matters with the same quiet efficiency he had shown during the birth, Rebecca felt something she had not expected. Not fear or gratitude, though both were present. What she felt was trust. This man, who had every reason to consider her an enemy, had risked his life to travel through a killing storm to help her. He had delivered her child with skill and gentleness, had treated her with respect and dignity at her most vulnerable moment. The stories she had heard about his people seemed impossibly distant now. Whatever Swift Arrow had done in battle, whatever conflicts had brought the Comanche and the settlers into opposition, none of that mattered in this small circle of candlelight where new life had just entered the world. Here, in this moment, he was simply a man who had chosen to preserve life rather than take it. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the Nebraska plains. But inside the soddy, warmed by an unexpected presence and the miracle of birth, Rebecca Morrison held her son and began to understand that salvation sometimes came from the most unlikely sources. The baby slept against Rebecca's chest while Swift Arrow worked to transform their frozen shelter into something resembling warmth and safety. He moved through the soddy with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making the best of harsh conditions, examining every corner and crevice with the calculating eye of a survivor. The single candle cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls as he assessed their resources and found them desperately wanting. "Fire first," he said, more to himself than to her, studying the cold cast-iron stove that squatted uselessly in the corner. Then food, then warmth for many days. His English continued to improve with use, the words coming more smoothly now, though still colored by the rhythms of his native tongue. "Storm not finished. Maybe 3-4 days more." Rebecca watched him work, marveling at how his presence had changed the entire atmosphere of the soddy. What had been a tomb just hours before now felt like a refuge. He radiated competence and calm in a way that made her believe they might actually survive this ordeal. The baby stirred in her arms, making small sounds that were not quite cries, and she adjusted the doeskin wrapping to keep him warm. Swift Arrow had produced a fire kit from somewhere in his clothing, a collection of flint, steel, and tinder that he handled with practiced ease. But instead of trying to coax flame from the frozen buffalo chips that Thomas had stacked beside the stove, He began dismantling one of the wooden shipping crates that served as furniture. The dry wood would burn hot and fast, he explained, better for getting a fire established in such cold conditions. Your husband, he said as he worked, breaking the crate apart with economical movements. When he returns? The question sent a jolt of anxiety through Rebecca. Thomas had said 2 weeks, but that was before the storm hit. He might have taken shelter in Ogallala, waiting for the weather to clear. Or he might have started back already, trying to reach her before the baby came. The thought of him struggling through the blizzard, possibly lost and freezing, made her stomach clench with worry. "Soon, I hope," she said, though the words felt hollow. "He went to fetch the doctor and supplies." She paused, studying Swift, Arrow's face in the flickering candlelight. "Why did you come here? How did you find me?" Swift Arrow's hands never stopped their work as he spoke, feeding kindling into the stove and coaxing the first small flames to life. "Hunting," he said simply. "Following the elk sign when the storm begins. Seek shelter, see smoke from your fire yesterday. Know someone here, maybe in trouble." He looked at her directly. "Woman alone in such a place, such weather. Very dangerous. Swift Arrow has daughters, know what could happen." The mention of his daughters surprised her. Somehow she had not imagined this fierce warrior as a father, but of course he would have family, somewhere. Children who waited for his return, just as she had waited for Thomas. The thought made him seem more human, less like the dangerous stranger she had initially feared, and more like a man doing what any decent person would do when faced with someone in need. The fire began to take hold, small flames licking at the dry wood and sending the first tendrils of precious heat into the frigid air. Swift Arrow fed it carefully, building it up slowly until the stove began to radiate real warmth. The change was immediate and profound. The baby relaxed in her arms, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular. Rebecca felt her own muscles begin to unknot as sensation returned to her extremities. "Better," Swift Arrow said with satisfaction, closing the stove door to contain the heat. "Now water, then food." He retrieved the frozen basin from beside the bed and set it on top of the stove, where the ice would melt. From his leather pouch came more surprises, a packet of dried meat, some kind of concentrated traveling food, and what looked like tea, made from pine needles and other herbs she could not identify. As the soddy began to warm, Rebecca found herself studying her unexpected savior more carefully. Without the bulky buffalo coat, he was leaner than she had initially thought, built like a runner or a horseman rather than a heavyweight fighter. His hands, as they moved about their tasks, were scarred but steady, with long fingers that handled delicate work with surprising precision. This was a man accustomed to taking care of others, she realized, a provider and protector by nature. The baby woke and began to fuss, the small sounds escalating toward a real cry. Rebecca tried to soothe him, but he seemed hungry and restless. Swift Arrow glanced over from where he was preparing some kind of broth from the dried meat and herbs. "Baby hungry," he observed. "Woman must eat also, make milk strong." He ladled some of the hot broth into a tin cup and brought it to her. The liquid was rich and flavorful, with a smoky taste that seemed to spread warmth through her entire body. "Elk meat," he explained, "good for new mothers, makes strong blood." As she sipped the broth, Rebecca found herself relaxing in ways she had not anticipated. The warmth, the food, the steady presence of someone competent and caring. All of it combined to create a sense of safety she had not felt since Thomas left. The baby latched onto Nurse, his small body warm and solid against her chest, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually survive this. Swift Arrow busied himself with practical matters, melting snow, for fresh water, arranging their meager supplies for maximum efficiency, checking the integrity of the soddy's walls and roof. He worked mostly in silence, but occasionally he would share observations or ask practical questions about their situation. Did they have more food stored elsewhere? How much firewood remained? When did she expect her husband's return? His questions were not idle curiosity, she realized, but part of a systematic assessment of their resources and challenges. He was planning ahead, calculating what they would need to survive, not just the next few hours, but potentially several more days trapped by the storm. The thoroughness of his approach impressed her and also drove home just how serious their situation remained despite his arrival. "You saved our lives," she said during a lull in his activities. "Both of us. We would have died without you." Swift Arrow paused in his work, considering her words. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe a woman's stronger than she knows. Maybe the baby's stronger too. Swift Arrow just helped what was already possible." He returned to his tasks, but she could see that her gratitude had touched him in some way. As the hours passed, an odd domestic routine began to establish itself. Swift Arrow tended the fire and prepared simple meals from his traveling supplies, supplemented by what little they had in the soddy. Rebecca nursed the baby and rested, gradually recovering her strength after the ordeal of birth. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, the shared understanding of people who had faced crisis together. The baby, whom she had begun thinking of as David after her father, proved to be remarkably hardy. He nursed well, slept peacefully, and showed all the signs of a healthy newborn despite the traumatic circumstances of his arrival. Swift Arrow examined him periodically with the same clinical competence he had shown during the delivery, pronouncing himself satisfied with the child's progress. "Strong boy," he would say, and Rebecca could hear genuine admiration in his voice. "Born in storm, but not afraid. Good sign for future." The storm outside continued with unabated fury, the wind howling around the soddy and rattling the single window with its force. But inside their small shelter, warmed by fire and sustained by shared purpose, the sound seemed less threatening. Swift Arrow had banked the fire to burn through the night and arranged their sleeping area to conserve heat most efficiently. He would take the floor, he announced, leaving the bed for her and the baby. "Floor good for Swift Arrow," he said when she protested. "Used to sleeping on ground. Woman needs soft bed after hard work." His matter-of-fact tone brooked no argument, and she found herself accepting his sacrifice with a mixture of gratitude and growing respect. As night deepened, they settled into their respective spaces. The baby slept between Rebecca and the wall, warm and secure in his doeskin wrapping. Swift Arrow lay near the stove, his buffalo coat serving as both mattress and blanket, positioned where he could tend the fire if needed during the night. The arrangement should have felt strange, sharing such close quarters with a man she had met only hours before, but instead it felt natural and safe. "Swift Arrow," she said softly into the darkness. "What will happen when the storm ends? When will my husband returns?" There was a long pause before he answered, and she could hear him considering the implications of her question. "Storm end, Swift Arrow go," he said finally. "Woman have husband, have baby, have life here. No need for a Comanche warrior." His voice carried no resentment, only practical acceptance of reality. But Rebecca found the thought of his departure troubling in ways she could not entirely explain. This man had risked his life to help her, had shown her kindness and competence when she needed it most. The idea of him simply disappearing back into the wilderness felt wrong somehow, inadequate recognition for what he had done. "You'll always be welcome here," she said, meaning it completely. "If you ever need shelter or help, you'll have it." Another pause, longer this time. When Swift Arrow spoke again, his voice was softer, touched by something that might have been emotion. "Woman has kind heart," he said. "Maybe someday paths cross again. Maybe not. But Swift Arrow, remember Rebecca Morrison. Remember a strong woman who trusted Comanche stranger. The use of her name startled her. She had not told him her surname, but somehow he knew it. Perhaps Thomas had mentioned it in some trading post or settlement where Swift Arrow had overheard, or perhaps he had, the ways of gathering information about the white settlers in his territory. Either way, it made their connection feel more real, more personal. Sleep came gradually, punctuated by the baby's periodic need to nurse and Swift Arrow's quiet movements as he maintained the fire. But it was restful sleep, the deep exhaustion of someone who had passed through a crisis and found safety on the other side. For the first time in weeks, Rebecca allowed herself to relax completely, trusting that someone else would keep watch while she recovered her strength. The second day of their confinement established patterns that would serve them through the remainder of the storm. Swift Arrow proved to be remarkably good company, despite the language barrier that occasionally caused confusion. He told stories of his travels across the plains, descriptions of places she had never seen, and animals she had only read about in books. His English improved steadily with practice, and she found herself picking up a few words of Comanche in return. He was fascinated by the few books Thomas had brought west, examining them with the careful attention of someone who understood their value even if he could not read them. She offered to teach him some letters, and he proved an eager student, his memory sharp and his curiosity genuine. In return, he shared knowledge of the land that no book could contain, how to read weather, signs, track animals, find water in seemingly barren country. The baby thrived under Swift Arrow's watchful care. He had an intuitive understanding of infant needs, knowing when David was hungry, cold, or simply fussy from spending too much time in one position. His large hands were surprisingly gentle when he held the child, and David seemed to respond to his calm presence with contentment. "You said you have daughters," Rebecca ventured during one of their quiet conversations. "Do you miss them?" Swift Arrow's expression grew thoughtful, distant. "Every day," he said simply, "but they safe with grandmother, with aunties. Learn women's ways, women's wisdom." He paused, studying the baby in his arms. "Sons learn different things, learn to hunt, to fight, to provide for family. But daughters—" He smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. "Daughters learn to make life, not just protect it." The comment revealed depths she had not expected, a philosophical side to this practical warrior that intrigued her. She found herself wondering about his family, his people, the life he lived when he was not traveling alone through blizzards to help strangers. The curiosity was dangerous, she knew. It made him more human, more real, harder to think of as simply a temporary presence in her life. On the third morning, the wind finally began to show signs of weakening. The constant howl that had become the soundtrack to their confinement dropped to occasional gusts, and the snow against the window seemed less dense. Swift Arrow noticed the change immediately, his weather sense more finely tuned than hers. "Storm breaking," he announced, checking the window for signs of clearing. "Maybe one more day, then safe to travel." The news should have filled her with relief, but instead she felt a strange reluctance. Their forced intimacy had created something unexpected, a bond that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Swift Arrow seemed to sense her mixed feelings. "Woman worry about husband," he said, though she suspected he understood more than that simple interpretation. Swift Arrow helped look for him when the weather clears. Track, find, bring home safe. The offer touched her deeply, another example of his instinctive generosity, but it also highlighted the complexity of their situation. How would Thomas react to finding a Comanche warrior in his home, caring for his wife and newborn son? Territorial tensions between settlers and Indians were real and often deadly. Even Swift Arrow's obvious good intentions might not be enough to prevent misunderstanding or conflict. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "But Thomas might not understand. He's heard stories about raids, about conflicts with your people. He might react poorly before he realizes you helped us." Swift Arrow nodded, unsurprised by her concern. "White men fear Comanche," he said matter-of-factly. "Some reason for fear. Some Comanche warriors angry about land, about broken promises. Make war, take horses, sometimes take lives." He looked directly at her. "But Swift Arrow is not at war with Rebecca Morrison, not at war with baby David. Something's more important than old fights." His use of the name she had chosen for her son startled her again. She had mentioned it only in passing, but he had remembered and adopted it as naturally as if David were his own grandchild. The casual intimacy of it spoke to how completely he had accepted his role in their small family circle. As the fourth day dawned, with noticeably calmer weather, Swift Arrow began preparing for departure. He repacked his traveling gear with the same methodical care he had shown in everything else, making sure Rebecca had adequate supplies for several more days if needed. He left most of his dried meat and all of his medicinal herbs, practical gifts that acknowledged the challenges she still faced. "Storm mostly finished," he said, checking the sky through the window. "Today or tomorrow, weather good for travel. Swift Arrow should go before husband returns." He paused in his packing, looking at her and the baby with an expression that might have been regret. "Hard to leave, but better this way." Rebecca knew he was right, but the approaching separation filled her with unexpected sadness. This man had appeared in her darkest hour and transformed it into something bearable, even meaningful. His departure would return her to the isolation she had known before, but now that isolation would feel different, lonelier, less complete. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said, holding David close, as if his small weight could anchor her against the coming loss. "You gave us life itself. How does someone repay that?" Swift Arrow finished packing and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious but kind. "Woman, live," he said simply. "Baby, live. Family strong and happy. That is enough payment for Swift Arrow. That is enough for any man with honor." The simplicity of his answer, the complete absence of expectation or demand for recognition, only made her admire him more. In her world, men often spoke of honor, but rarely demonstrated it so clearly through action. Swift Arrow had risked everything for strangers, and asked nothing in return except that they use the life he had helped preserve. As afternoon approached, and the sky continued to clear, they both knew the moment of parting was near. Swift Arrow had retrieved his buffalo coat and checked his horse, which had somehow survived the storm in the crude shelter of the barn. The animal was hardy and well-trained, clearly accustomed to harsh conditions and long journeys. "Time to go," he said finally, though he made no immediate move toward the door. The baby was awake, looking up at him with the unfocused attention of the very young, and Swift Arrow touched one finger gently to the small hand that reached toward him. "Grow strong, David Morrison," he said softly. "Be a good man like your father. Be kind to all people, even strangers." Rebecca felt tears threatening, an emotional response that surprised her with its intensity. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Though she knew the question was unfair, his life was nomadic, unpredictable, shaped by forces she could not understand or anticipate. "Maybe," Swift Arrow said, but his tone suggested he thought it unlikely. Prairie, big place. Many paths, but not all crossed twice. He shouldered his pack and moved toward the door, then paused. "But Rebecca Morrison is always in Swift Arrow's prayers. Baby David is always in Swift Arrow's heart. That will not change, even if paths do not cross again." He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air that made the baby fuss briefly. Outside, the world was brilliantly white under clearing skies, the snow still deep but no longer falling. His horse waited patiently, breath steaming in the frigid air. "Goodbye, Swift Arrow," Rebecca said, her voice barely steady. "Safe travels. May you find your daughters well when you return to them." He smiled one last time, mounted his horse with fluid grace, and rode away across the snow-covered prairie. Rebecca watched from the window until he disappeared over a distant ridge, just another dark speck against the endless white landscape. When he was gone, the soddy felt impossibly empty, despite the crackling fire and the warm weight of her son in her arms. But Swift Arrow had left more than just supplies and warmth. He had left the knowledge that kindness could come from unexpected sources, that humanity transcended the boundaries people drew between themselves and others. As she settled back into the routine of caring for her newborn, Rebecca carried with her the memory of gentle hands and steady eyes, of a warrior who had chosen to preserve life rather than take it. The foundation of trust he had built during those 4 days would prove stronger than she yet realized, creating ripples that would extend far beyond their brief time together. Thomas Morrison arrived 3 days after Swift Arrow's departure, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and accompanied by Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a thin, nervous man whose medical bag had seen better days. Rebecca heard the horses long before she saw them, their hoofbeats muffled by the snow, but distinct enough to send her heart racing. She had been dreading this moment almost as much as she had longed for it, knowing that Thomas's return would bring complications she was not ready to face. She watched from the window as her husband dismounted, his movements stiff with cold and exhaustion. Even from a distance, she could see the worry etched in his face, the way his eyes swept over the soddy looking for signs of disaster. Behind him, Dr. Hartwell struggled with his own horse, clearly uncomfortable with frontier travel and eager to be done with his journey. Thomas burst through the door without knocking, his eyes wild with concern until they found her sitting by, the fire with the baby in her arms. For a moment he simply stood there, taking in the scene, his wife alive and well, a newborn child, the warm interior of their home that should have been a frozen tomb. Relief flooded his face, followed quickly by confusion. "Rebecca," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "Thank God. When I saw the storm, I thought—" He knelt beside her chair, his cold hands reaching out to touch her face, to convince himself she was real. How? How did you survive? How did you manage the birth alone? The questions she had been dreading. Rebecca held David closer, buying herself a moment to think. Behind Thomas, Dr. Hartwell had entered more cautiously, his professional eye already assessing the situation. She could see him noting the evidence of a successful delivery, the supplies and arrangements that spoke of competent medical care. "I wasn't alone," she said finally, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Someone came. Someone helped." Thomas's expression darkened immediately. In the frontier territory, unexpected visitors often meant trouble. "Who?" "Miller, one of the neighbors." "From Down Creek?" "No." Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing there was no way to make this easy. "A Comanche brave. He was seeking shelter from the storm and heard me in labor. He stayed to help deliver David." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas went very still, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and something approaching rage. Dr. Hartwell dropped his medical bag, the instruments inside clattering against each other with metallic discord. Both men stared at her as if she had announced that she had been visited by ghosts. "A Comanche," Thomas said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "You let a savage into our home, while you were helpless, with our child." Each word was measured, controlled, but Rebecca could hear the fury building beneath the surface. "He saved our lives, Thomas. Both David and I would have died without him." She tried to keep her voice steady, reasonable, but she could feel the situation spiraling away from her control. He was gentle, skilled. He knew what he was doing. Skilled, Thomas repeated, standing abruptly and beginning to pace the small confines of the soddy. Of course he was skilled, probably skilled at killing and scalping too. Do you have any idea what you've done, what you've risked? Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should examine the patient first, discuss the circumstances. Afterward. The important thing is that both mother and child appear to be in good health, but Thomas was beyond rational discussion. The fear he had carried for days, combined with the shock of Rebecca's revelation, had transformed into something more dangerous. You trusted our lives, our child's life, to a painted savage. They're not human, Rebecca. They're animals, killers. How could you be so foolish? The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. The man Thomas was describing bore no resemblance to Swift Arrow, to the gentle hands that had delivered David, to the patient voice that had guided her through the worst hours of her life. The disconnect was so complete, it made her question whether they were talking about the same person. He wasn't a savage, she said, her own voice growing stronger. He was a man who chose to help when he could have simply passed by. A man who risked his own life to travel through the storm to reach us. A man who asked for nothing in return. Nothing in return, Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think he did this out of kindness? They're probably watching us right now, planning to come back for you and the baby. This was reconnaissance, Rebecca. You've given them information about our defenses, our resources, our vulnerabilities. Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Mr. Morrison, perhaps we might focus on the medical aspects of the situation. I should examine your wife and the child to ensure they're recovering properly from the birth. Thomas spun on the doctor, his eyes blazing. Medical aspects? The medical aspect is that she allowed a hostile Indian into our home while she was giving birth. Do you understand what that means? They know she's here alone most of the time. They know our routines, our weaknesses. We're sitting targets now. Rebecca felt something harden inside her chest. The gratitude and relief she had felt at Thomas's safe return was rapidly being replaced by anger and disappointment. This was not the homecoming she had imagined during the long nights when she wasn't sure they would survive. Swift Arrow is not a threat to us, she said firmly. If he wanted to harm us, he had every opportunity. Instead, he chose to help. He saved your son's life, Thomas. Your son. Swift Arrow. Thomas's voice rose to nearly a shout. You know his name. You had conversations with him. Jesus Christ, Rebecca, do you realize what you've done? The baby began to cry, startled by the raised voices and the tension filling the small space. Rebecca automatically began to rock him, her maternal instincts taking over despite the emotional turmoil surrounding them. The sight of his son seemed to calm Thomas slightly, but the anger remained. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward diplomatically. Perhaps I might examine the child first. Birth under such extreme conditions can sometimes lead to complications that aren't immediately apparent. Rebecca reluctantly handed David to the doctor, though every instinct screamed against letting him go. Hartwell's hands were cold and clinical as he examined the baby, a stark contrast to Swift Arrow's warm, confident touch. The doctor's movements were technically correct, but lacked the intuitive understanding that had made her trust the Comanche warrior so completely. Remarkable, Hartwell murmured as he completed his examination. The child is in excellent health. Perfect muscle tone, good reflexes, no signs of distress or complications. Whoever delivered him did exceptional work under impossible conditions. The admission seemed to anger Thomas further rather than mollify him. So he knows something about birthing. That doesn't make him trustworthy. Indians learn about anatomy from torturing their enemies, not from helping people. That's enough. Rebecca's voice cut through the soddy like a blade. I will not listen to you speak that way about a man who saved our lives. Whatever your feelings about his people, Swift Arrow showed us nothing but kindness and skill. He treated us with respect and dignity when we were at our most vulnerable. Thomas stared at her as if seeing a stranger. You're defending him. My God, Rebecca, you're actually defending a savage who could have killed you both without a second thought. I'm defending the truth, she replied, matching his stare with one of her own. And the truth is that your son is alive because of Swift Arrow's courage and skill. Nothing you say can change that fact. Dr. Hartwell, clearly desperate to diffuse the tension, intervened again. The important thing is that everyone is safe and healthy. Perhaps we should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. But Thomas was far from finished. He had clearly been building toward this confrontation since the moment he learned of Swift Arrow's involvement. The future is exactly what I'm worried about. They'll be back, Rebecca. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they'll be back. And next. Time it won't be to help. It will be to collect on whatever debt they think you owe them. The accusation was so far from anything Swift Arrow had demonstrated that Rebecca felt a surge of protective anger. He owes us nothing. We owe him everything. If anyone comes back, it will be because they need help, just as we needed help. You naive fool, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have no idea what these people are capable of. The settlers down in Texas, the wagon trains that never made it through. You think your precious Swift Arrow is different from the warriors who did those things? Rebecca thought of the gentle way Swift Arrow had handled David, the patient hours he had spent teaching her Comanche words, the stories he had told of his daughters. The man Thomas was describing existed only in the fearful imaginings of people who had never actually met a member of the Comanche nation. Yes, she said simply, I do think he's different, because I saw who he really was, not who you think he should be based on stories and prejudice. The word hung in the air between them, like a challenge. Thomas's face went white, then red with fury. Prejudice! You call it prejudice to be concerned about the safety of my family, to worry about a race of people who have been at war with settlers since we first crossed the Mississippi? Dr. Hartwell stepped between them, his medical training finally overriding his discomfort with confrontation. This argument is serving no one. Mrs. Morrison has been through a traumatic experience and needs rest, not conflict. Perhaps we might table this discussion until everyone has had time to process what's happened. But Thomas was beyond reasonable discourse. The fear he had carried during the storm, combined with his frontier prejudices and the shock of discovering his wife's trust in their traditional enemy, had created a perfect storm of emotional volatility. There's nothing to process. We're packing up and leaving today. This place is compromised. Leaving? Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. Thomas, this is our home, our land. We've invested everything we have in this place, and it's all worthless. Now that they know where we are, he replied, already moving toward their meager possessions. We'll go to town, maybe back to Kansas, somewhere with proper defenses and civilized people. The casual dismissal of everything they had worked for, built together, dreamed about, hit Rebecca harder than any of his previous words. This soddy represented their future, their children's inheritance, their stake in the developing frontier. To abandon it based on unfounded fears felt like a betrayal of their original vision. I won't go, she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. This is where David was born. This is where we belong. Thomas stopped packing and turned to stare at her. You won't go? No, I won't run from imaginary threats. I won't abandon our home because you're afraid of shadows. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken tensions and fundamental disagreements about the nature of the frontier and the people they shared it with. Dr. Hartwell looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he had never agreed to make this journey. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice deadly calm. You're my wife, Rebecca. The child is my son. You'll go where I say we go, when I say we go." The words revealed an aspect of her husband that Rebecca had glimpsed before, but never seen so clearly. Beneath his practical exterior lay a man who expected absolute obedience, who saw her opinions as suggestions to be considered or dismissed at his discretion. The contrast with Swift Arrow's respectful treatment of her autonomy could not have been more stark. "I'm your partner," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "not your property. And I'm David's mother, which gives me just as much say in his future as you have." Thomas's face darkened further. "You've been out here too long, isolated. It's affected your judgment, made you susceptible to influences that would never have swayed you back in civilization." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He was dismissing her position not on its merits, but because he believed the frontier had somehow damaged her capacity for rational thought. The assumption that her defense of Swift Arrow stemmed from female weakness rather than actual experience infuriated her. "My judgment is fine, Thomas. It's your prejudice that's clouding the situation." Dr. Hartwell, sensing that the argument was escalating beyond anything he could mediate, began repacking his medical supplies. "Perhaps I should return to town and leave you both to resolve this privately," he said diplomatically. "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're going to examine my wife thoroughly and give me a complete report on her condition. I want to know if there's any evidence of impropriety." The implication hit Rebecca like a slap. Thomas was suggesting that Swift Arrow had taken advantage of her vulnerable condition, that the medical care had been cover for assault. The accusation was so far from the truth, so insulting to both her and Swift Arrow's honor, that she felt physically sick. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you suggest such a thing?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Thomas replied coldly. "I'm simply being prudent. A woman alone with a savage for 4 days. It's only natural to be concerned about what might have happened." Dr. Hartwell looked mortified. "Mr. Morrison, I hardly think such an examination is necessary or appropriate. Your wife shows no signs of trauma or distress beyond what would be expected from a difficult birth." But Thomas was relentless. "I insist, doctor, for the family's sake, for the child's legitimacy." The final insult, questioning David's parentage, broke something inside Rebecca. The baby in question was sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware that his father was suggesting he might be the product of assault rather than love. The injustice of it, the casual cruelty, made her see Thomas clearly for perhaps the first time since their marriage. "Get out," she said quietly. Thomas blinked, clearly not having expected such a response. "What?" "Get out of my house, both of you." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "If you can't trust me, if you can't respect me, if you can't see the truth when it's right in front of you, then I don't want you here." "Rebecca, you're being hysterical." "I'm being rational for the first time in months," she cut him off. "I see now what kind of man I married, what kind of father my son has, and I don't like what I see." Thomas stared at her in shock, clearly never having imagined that his wife might possess the strength to stand up to him. Dr. Hartwell gathered his bag hastily, obviously desperate to escape the domestic conflict that had erupted around him. "You can't throw me out of my own home," Thomas said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "It's not your home anymore," Rebecca replied with a calm that surprised even her. "It's mine and David's. You made your choice when you decided to trust your prejudices over your wife. Now live with the consequences." The confrontation had reached a point where retreat was impossible for either side. Thomas had revealed too much of his true nature, and Rebecca had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The rift between them was no longer about Swift Arrow or frontier safety. It was about fundamental differences in how they viewed the world and their place in it. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another night of bitter cold. But inside the soddy, the real storm was just beginning. The return of the past had brought not comfort and security, but conflict, and the shattering of illusions that had sustained Rebecca through the hardest months of frontier life. As Thomas and Dr. Hartwell prepared to leave, defeated by her unexpected resistance, Rebecca held David close and thought about the choice she had made. She was choosing uncertainty over security, isolation over companionship, principle over pragmatism. But she was also choosing dignity over submission, truth over comfortable lies, and the memory of genuine kindness over the reality of conditional love. The foundation that Swift Arrow had helped her build was proving stronger than she had imagined, strong enough to support not just survival, but the kind of independence she had never dared to claim before. As the two men rode away into the gathering darkness, Rebecca Morrison began to understand that her real journey toward freedom had only just begun. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was different from any quiet Rebecca had ever experienced. It was not the peaceful silence of contentment or the anxious silence of waiting. This was the silence of decisions made and bridges burned, of a woman who had chosen her path and now faced the full weight of its consequences. She sat in the growing darkness of the soddy, David sleeping in her arms, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just done. She had thrown out her husband. In 1886, Nebraska, wives simply did not do such things. Marriage was a contract that bound women to obedience, dependence, and submission, regardless of personal cost. Society offered no support for wives who refused to follow their husbands, no safety net for women who chose independence over security. Yet here she sat, alone with her newborn son, having made exactly that choice. The practical implications began to sink in as the first shock wore off. Thomas controlled their bank account, their credit at the general store, their legal claim to the homestead. Without his signature, she could not buy supplies, could not sell crops or livestock, could not even legally remain on land that was technically his by right of filing. She had claimed ownership in the heat of the moment, but the harsh reality was that she possessed only what she could physically defend, and winter was far from over. Rebecca lit the oil lamp and surveyed her resources with the calculating eye. Swift Arrow had taught her during their days together. Enough firewood for perhaps a week if she was careful, food for 3 days, maybe 4 if she rationed strictly. The cow and horses were still in the barn, but caring for livestock in deep snow would be nearly impossible for a woman recovering from childbirth. Even if she managed the physical demands, there was no guarantee Thomas wouldn't return with the sheriff to reclaim his property. But as daunting as the practical challenges were, they paled beside the emotional earthquake that had just reshaped her world. For 2 years she had built her identity around being Thomas Morrison's wife, defining herself through his ambitions and dreams. The discovery that he could suspect her of betrayal, could question David's legitimacy, could dismiss her judgment as female weakness, had shattered that foundation completely. The woman who remained in the wreckage was someone Rebecca barely recognized, stronger than she had imagined, angrier than she had ever allowed herself to be, and more determined to control her own destiny than she had thought possible. The transformation was as frightening as it was liberating. David stirred, in her arms, making the small sounds that meant he would soon wake hungry. The simple needs of her son provided an anchor in the storm of uncertainty, a concrete purpose that transcended the larger questions about her future. Whatever else happened, she would protect and provide for this child. Everything else was negotiable. As she nursed David by lamplight, Rebecca found her thoughts turning inevitably to Swift Arrow. The contrast between his respectful treatment of her and Thomas's controlling assumptions could not have been more stark. The Comanche warrior had seen her as a competent partner in the fight for survival, trusting her judgment and honoring her choices. Thomas saw her as property to be managed, an asset whose value depended on her compliance with his wishes. The irony was bitter. The man her husband branded as savage had shown her more respect and dignity than her own spouse ever had. Swift Arrow had asked for nothing, taken nothing, forced nothing. He had simply offered help when it was needed and withdrawn when his purpose was complete. Thomas demanded obedience, loyalty, and submission as his due, giving little consideration to what she might need or want in return. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding thoughts. For a moment, hope flared that Thomas had returned to apologize, to take back his harsh words and accusations. But when she opened the door, she found Ezra Hutchins, their nearest neighbor from 5 miles down the creek. The old bachelor farmer stood hunched against the cold, his weathered face grave with concern. "Evening, Mrs. Morrison," he said, removing his hat despite the frigid air. "Saw your husband and the doc riding past my place, hell-bent for town. Figured I ought to check on you and the baby, make sure everything was all right." The kindness in his voice almost undid her composure. Ezra was known throughout the territory as a decent man, someone who helped his neighbors without expectation of reward. His concern felt genuine, uncomplicated by the political and personal agendas that had poisoned her interaction with Thomas. "Come in, please," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "It's too cold to talk outside." Ezra entered cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight. He was a small man, wiry and tough as jerky, with intelligent blue eyes that missed very little. Rebecca had always liked him, appreciated his quiet competence and dry humor. Now his presence felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Fine-looking boy," he said, studying David with the careful attention of someone who knew babies. "Strong lungs, good color, seems to be thriving despite the circumstances." He glanced around the soddy, taking in the signs of recent conflict. The overturned chair, the scattered papers where Thomas had been gathering documents. "Everything all right between you and Thomas?" The direct question caught Rebecca off guard. Ezra was not given to prying into other people's business, but something about the scene had obviously concerned him enough to speak up. She found herself caught between the impulse to maintain appearances and the desperate need to confide in someone who might understand. "We've had a disagreement," she said carefully, settling David back in his makeshift cradle. "About the future, about what's best for our family." Ezra studied her face in the flickering lamplight, his expression thoughtful. Must have been some disagreement for Thomas to go tearing off to town in the middle of winter with a new baby in the house. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Want to talk about it?" The invitation hung in the air between them. Rebecca weighed the risks of confiding in Ezra against the relief of sharing her burden with someone who might offer practical advice. Finally, the need for honest conversation won out over caution. "A Comanche brave helped deliver David during the storm," she said, watching Ezra's face for his reaction. "Thomas believes this makes us targets for future attacks. He wants to abandon the homestead and move back to Kansas." To her surprise, Ezra merely nodded as if such news was not particularly shocking. "Makes sense. Someone would seek shelter during that blizzard. Lucky for you, he knew something about birthing." He paused, studying her expression. "I take it you don't agree with Thomas's assessment of the threat? The man who helped us was honorable," Rebecca said firmly. "He could have harmed us in any number of ways, but chose to help instead. Thomas refuses to consider that possibility. He sees only what he expects to see." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his tone was carefully neutral. "Comanche, you said. You happened to catch his name?" "Swift Arrow." The name felt natural on her tongue now, no longer foreign or frightening, but simply the designation of someone who had played a crucial role in her life. Ezra's eyebrows rose slightly. Swift arrow, well, I'll be damned. He caught himself and glanced apologetically at her. Pardon the language, but that explains a few things. You know him. Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. Know of him anyway. Traded with his band a few times over the years. They winter up north of here, in the breaks along the Niobrara. Swift Arrow's got a reputation as an honourable man, far as that goes. Never broke his word in any dealing I heard of. Ezra's expression grew more serious. Course, that don't mean much to folks who figure the only good Indian is a dead Indian. The validation of her judgment felt like a physical weight lifted from her shoulders. Here was someone who actually knew Swift Arrow by reputation, who could confirm that her trust had not been misplaced. The knowledge gave her strength to continue defending her position. Thomas wants me to submit to a medical examination, she said, the words bitter in her mouth, to verify that nothing inappropriate happened during those 4 days. Ezra's face darkened with anger. That's insulting to everyone involved, he said bluntly. You, the baby, and Swift Arrow too. Thomas ought to be ashamed of himself for even suggesting such a thing. The righteous indignation in Ezra's voice was balm to Rebecca's wounded spirit. Finally, someone who understood the violation inherent in Thomas's suspicions, someone who recognized the insult to her character and judgment. The support gave her courage to reveal the full scope of the conflict. I threw him out, she said, quietly. Told him to leave and not come back until he could trust me and treat me with respect. Ezra whistled softly, a sound of amazement rather than disapproval. Takes sand to stand up to a husband like that. Most women would have just endured it and hoped for better days. I couldn't endure it, not after seeing what real respect looks like. She thought of Swift Arrow's careful attention to her needs, his trust in her judgment, his gentle treatment of David. I deserve better than suspicion and control masquerading as protection. Yes, ma'am, you do, Ezra agreed firmly. Question is, what do you plan to do about it? Thomas ain't likely to just accept being dismissed from his own home. The practical considerations came rushing back. Rebecca outlined her situation. The legal vulnerabilities, the financial constraints, the physical challenges of maintaining the homestead alone. Ezra listened without interruption, his face growing more concerned as the list of obstacles grew. You're right to worry, he said when she finished. Law's not on your side in a situation like this. Thomas comes back with the sheriff. There's not much you can do to stop him from reclaiming his property. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, less you were to file charges of your own. What kind of charges? Abandonment, for starters. Man leaves his wife and newborn baby alone in winter. That might raise some eyebrows with a reasonable judge, especially if you had witnesses to testify about his behavior, his accusations, his refusal to believe your account of events. Rebecca felt a spark of hope. You would testify. If it came to that, yes. What Swift Arrow did was decent and honorable. What Thomas is doing is shameful. I'd have no trouble saying so under oath. Ezra's expression grew more serious. But you need to understand what you'll be getting into. Fighting this kind of battle will make you enemies. Folks don't like to see women standing up to their husbands. Makes them nervous about their own situations. The warning was sobering, but not unexpected. Rebecca had known from the moment she told Thomas to leave that she was stepping outside the bounds of acceptable female behavior. The question was whether she had the strength to see it through, to face the social isolation and legal challenges that would inevitably follow. I can't go back to the way things were, she said finally. I won't pretend that what happened here was wrong when I know it was right. If that makes people uncomfortable, so be it. Ezra smiled for the first time since arriving. Swift Arrow chose well when he decided to help you. You've got the backbone for this fight. He stood, preparing to leave. But you're going to need more than backbone. You're going to need allies, resources, and a plan that accounts for all the ways Thomas might try to get back at you. Over the next hour, Ezra helped Rebecca think through her options with the pragmatic clarity of someone who had survived decades on the frontier. They identified potential supporters in the community, other women who had chafed under their husbands' control, men who valued fairness over convention, business owners who might benefit from having an independent customer rather than one controlled by Thomas's increasingly erratic judgment. More importantly, Ezra outlined practical steps Rebecca could take to strengthen her legal position. Filing a formal complaint with the territorial authorities about Thomas's abandonment and accusations, documenting her ability to manage the homestead independently, building relationships with neighbors who could testify to her competence, and, on character, the key is to make yourself indispensable to the community, he explained. If folks see you as valuable, as a midwife maybe, given what you've been through, they'll be more inclined to support your independence. Nobody wants to lose a resource that might save their own lives someday. The idea had merit. Rebecca's experience with David's birth, guided by Swift Arrow's knowledge, had given her insights into childbirth that few frontier women possessed. With proper training and practice, she could become a valuable medical resource for isolated homesteads throughout the territory. As Ezra prepared to leave, he made her an offer that took her breath away. I've got supplies you can use, food, firewood, whatever you need, to get through the winter. Consider it a loan against future services. I'll also spread the word that you're available to help with difficult births, medical emergencies, things like that? Why? Rebecca asked, overwhelmed by his generosity. Why would you risk taking my side against Thomas? Ezra paused at the door, his hat in his hands. Because what's right is right, regardless of what's legal or conventional. And because I've got daughters back in Illinois who might someday need the kind of courage you're showing. If supporting you makes it easier for them to stand up for themselves when their time comes, then it's the least I can do. After he left, Rebecca sat by the dying fire and contemplated the path that stretched ahead of her. It would be difficult, dangerous, and uncertain. She would face opposition from her husband, skepticism from the community, and legal challenges that could cost her everything she had worked for. But for the first time since Thomas's return, she felt hope. The foundation Swift Arrow had helped. Her build was proving strong enough to support not just survival, but transformation. The quiet Comanche warrior who had appeared in her darkest hour had given her more than medical assistance. He had shown her what she was capable of becoming. Now it was up to her to have the courage to become that person. David stirred in his sleep, making small sounds of contentment. Rebecca looked down at her son and made him a promise that would guide all her future decisions. He would grow up knowing that his mother had chosen dignity over security, truth over convenience, independence over submission. Whatever the cost, that legacy would be worth the price. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and testing the walls of the soddy. But inside, Rebecca Morrison sat straighter, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. The real battle for her freedom was about to begin, and she intended to win it on her own terms. The woman who had been abandoned by her stepmother's decision years before would not abandon herself now. The woman who had trusted a stranger because he proved himself trustworthy would not distrust her own judgment because others questioned it. The woman who had brought new life into the world against impossible odds would not let that life be diminished by small-minded fears and petty tyrannies. Rebecca Morrison was done being afraid. Now she was ready to fight. The knock came at dawn 3 weeks later, sharp and official in its cadence. Rebecca had been expecting it since the day she threw Thomas out, but her heart still jumped as she recognized the sound of authority. Through the frost-covered window, she could see 3 figures on horseback. Thomas, Sheriff Coleman, and a man in a black suit who could only be a lawyer. They had come to reclaim what the law said belonged to them. Rebecca adjusted David's position in her arms and smoothed her dress before opening the door. She had spent the weeks since Thomas's departure preparing for this moment, gathering documents, building alliances, and most importantly, documenting her ability to manage the homestead independently. The woman who faced the three men was, fundamentally, different from the one who had cowered in fear during the blizzard. "Mrs. Morrison," Sheriff Coleman said, touching his hat brim respectfully. He was a decent man, caught in an uncomfortable situation, trying to balance legal requirements with his obvious unease about the circumstances. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but your husband has filed a formal complaint. Says you're refusing him access to his lawful property and keeping his child from him unlawfully." "Sheriff," Rebecca replied calmly, "I appreciate you coming out in this weather, but I believe there are some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Won't you come inside where we can discuss this properly?" Thomas started to push forward, but Sheriff Coleman held up a restraining hand. Protocol demanded that he hear both sides before taking action, and Rebecca's composed demeanor had clearly given him pause. The three men entered the soddy, and Rebecca was gratified to see their surprise at the neat, well-organized interior. She had used the weeks well, creating an environment that spoke of competence and stability rather than the chaos Thomas had predicted. The man in the black suit introduced himself as Jeremiah Blackwood, a lawyer from Ogallala who specialized in property disputes. His cold eyes swept over Rebecca with undisguised contempt, clearly expecting to cow a hysterical woman into submission. Instead, he found someone who met his gaze steadily and offered him coffee with perfect composure. "Mr. Blackwood," Rebecca said, settling David in his cradle before turning to face the three men. "I assume you've heard my husband's version of recent events. I wonder if you'd be interested in hearing mine before you make any legal determinations." Blackwood exchanged glances with Thomas, who was clearly becoming agitated by Rebecca's unexpected poise. "Mrs. Morrison, the law is quite clear in matters of marital property and child custody. Your husband has absolute rights in both areas. This meeting is merely a formality before we proceed with enforcement." "Actually," Rebecca replied, reaching for a folder she had prepared, "I believe the law is more complex than you suggest, particularly in cases involving abandonment, neglect of marital duties, and false accusations of moral turpitude." The legal terminology stopped all three men short. This was not the language of a desperate, emotional woman, but of someone who had done her homework thoroughly. Rebecca had spent long evenings by lamplight studying the territorial statutes, helped by books Ezra had brought from his collection and advice from other women who had faced similar challenges. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am, what exactly are you claiming?" Rebecca opened the folder and began reading from carefully prepared notes. "On February 15th, Thomas Morrison abandoned his pregnant wife in the middle of a severe blizzard, leaving her without adequate supplies, medical assistance, or means of communication. This abandonment continued for over 2 weeks, during which time Mrs. Morrison gave birth alone and nearly died from complications." "That's not what happened," Thomas interjected angrily. "I went to get the doctor and supplies. The storm delayed my return." "The storm ended on February 20th, Rebecca continued calmly. "You didn't return until February 27th, 12 days after travel became possible again. During your absence, I was forced to rely on the kindness of strangers to survive." She looked directly at Blackwood. "I have witnesses who can testify to these facts." Blackwood frowned, clearly not having expected this level of preparation. "Mrs. Morrison, even if your timeline is accurate, your husband's delay hardly constitutes legal abandonment, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to deny him access to his property and child." "Ah," Rebecca said, producing another document. from her folder, but it does give me grounds to file countercharges. Abandonment, failure to provide adequate care for a pregnant spouse, and most seriously, false accusations designed to damage my reputation and character. She handed Sheriff Coleman a formal complaint she had filed with the territorial court the previous week. His eyebrows rose as he read the detailed account of Thomas's accusations about her relationship with Swift Arrow, his demands for a humiliating medical examination, and his threats to abandon their homestead based on unfounded fears. Furthermore, Rebecca continued, I have documentation of my ability to maintain this property independently, sworn statements from neighbors attesting to my competence, records of successful livestock management, and proof of income from medical services provided to the community. This last claim was slight exaggeration. She had assisted with only one difficult birth since David's arrival, but the implication was clear. Rebecca Morrison was not a helpless woman dependent on male protection, but a capable individual contributing to the community's welfare. Thomas was growing increasingly agitated. This is ridiculous. She's my wife. The child is my son. I don't need to justify my decisions to anyone. Actually, Sheriff Coleman said slowly, still reading through Rebecca's complaint, territorial law does provide some protections for abandoned spouses, especially in cases involving newborn children. He looked at Blackwood. This isn't as straightforward as you suggested. Blackwood's confidence was clearly shaken, but he rallied quickly. Sheriff, regardless of any technical complications, the fundamental issue remains. Mrs. Morrison is refusing her husband access to his lawful property. That's theft, pure and simple. It would be theft, Rebecca agreed, if this were actually his property. But I believe you'll find that the homestead claim was filed jointly in both our names, as required by territorial law for married couples. She produced yet another document, a copy of their original filing that clearly showed both signatures. As co-owner, I have every right to control access to this property, particularly when I have legitimate concerns about my husband's judgment and intentions. The revelation that Rebecca had retained legal ownership rights clearly caught all three men off guard. Thomas had apparently assumed that his wife would have no knowledge of such technicalities, while Blackwood had failed to research the property records thoroughly before making his threats. Sheriff Coleman was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. Mr. Morrison, did you know about the joint filing? Thomas's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Of course I knew, It's a technicality. Wives don't actually exercise those rights independently. But they can, Rebecca said firmly. And in this case I am. She turned to Sheriff Coleman. I'm not trying to deny Thomas all access to David. I'm simply insisting that any custody arrangements be made through proper legal channels, with appropriate protections for both mother and child. The reasonable tone and moderate position made Rebecca's stance harder to attack. She wasn't being vindictive or emotional, but was asking for exactly what any prudent person would demand in a similar situation. The contrast with Thomas's increasingly agitated behavior was becoming more apparent by the minute. Blackwood made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Morrison, these legal maneuvers are all very interesting, but they don't address the fundamental issue. You've admitted to harboring a hostile Indian in your home, exposing yourself and your child to danger. That demonstrates such poor judgment that it calls into question your fitness as a mother. Rebecca had been waiting for this argument, the one she knew would be Thomas's ultimate weapon against her. Mr. Blackwood, I've admitted to accepting life-saving medical assistance from a qualified individual during a medical emergency. The fact that this person happened to be Comanche is irrelevant to the quality of care provided or the appropriateness of my decision. Irrelevant, Thomas exploded. "He's a savage, a killer. How can you call that irrelevant?" "I call it irrelevant, because I judge people by their actions, not their race," Rebecca replied, with steel in her voice. "Swift Arrow's actions were those of a skilled medical practitioner and an honorable human being. Your actions, Thomas, have been those of a suspicious, controlling husband who trusts prejudice over evidence." Sheriff Coleman held up his hand to prevent Thomas from responding. "Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, do you have any evidence to support your claims about this Indian's character and qualifications?" Rebecca smiled, having anticipated this question. "Well, actually I do." She reached into her folder once more and produced a letter that made all three men stare in surprise. A sworn statement from Dr. Martin Westfield in Ogallala, testifying to Swift Arrow's medical knowledge and skill. Dr. Westfield has worked with him on several occasions to treat difficult cases, and he confirms that the care I received was professionally competent and appropriate. The letter was genuine, obtained through Ezra's connections in town. Dr. Westfield was a respected physician who had indeed worked with various Indian healers and had no qualms about acknowledging their expertise when it was warranted. His professional endorsement of Swift Arrow's actions carried significant weight in legal proceedings. Blackwood read the letter carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each line. "This is unexpected," he admitted reluctantly. "But it still doesn't change the fundamental question of marital authority and property rights, doesn't it?" Rebecca asked. "If my judgment in accepting medical help was professionally sound, as Dr. Westfield confirms, then what basis does my husband have for claiming I'm unfit to make decisions about my own welfare and that of my child?" Question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas had built his entire case on the premise that Rebecca's trust in Swift Arrow demonstrated dangerous poor judgment. If that premise was false, if her decision had actually been wise and appropriate, then his demands for control became much harder to justify. Sheriff Coleman was clearly struggling with the complexities of the situation. "Mr. Morrison, I have to say, your wife seems to have documented her position pretty thoroughly. I'm not sure I can just ignore her claims and enforce yours without a proper hearing." "A hearing?" Thomas looked panicked at the prospect of having his accusations examined in open court. "Sheriff, this is a simple matter of a wife refusing to obey her husband. It shouldn't require a hearing." "Actually," Rebecca interjected, "I welcome a hearing. I'd be happy to have all the facts presented publicly, with witnesses testifying under oath about what really happened during those crucial weeks." She looked directly at Thomas. "Would you be equally comfortable with that level of scrutiny?" The challenge was clear. Rebecca was betting that Thomas would not want his behavior examined closely in a public forum, particularly if witnesses could testify to his abandonment of his pregnant wife and his subsequent accusations. A hearing would also allow her supporters in the community to speak on her behalf, potentially swaying public opinion in her favor. Blackwood whispered urgently in Thomas's ear for several minutes before addressing the group again. "Perhaps we could arrange some sort of compromise, limited visitation rights for Mr. Morrison while the legal questions are resolved through proper channels." Rebecca considered this carefully. It was less than Thomas wanted, but more than she was comfortable with, given his volatile behavior and accusations. However, it might also be her best chance to demonstrate that she was reasonable and willing to work within the system, rather than simply being obstructionist. "I might be willing to consider supervised visitation," she said finally, "with appropriate safeguards for both David and myself, perhaps with Sheriff Coleman or another neutral party present to ensure everyone's safety and proper behavior." The suggestion of supervision clearly rankled Thomas, but it also made Rebecca's position look more reasonable to the sheriff. She was willing to allow access, but wanted protection against the kind of emotional volatility Thomas had already demonstrated. Sheriff Coleman nodded approvingly. That seems like a reasonable compromise while the legal issues get sorted out. Mr. Morrison, would you be willing to accept supervised visits for now? Thomas looked as if he wanted to refuse, but Blackwood's urgent whispers convinced him otherwise. Fine, he said through gritted teeth, but this is temporary. I want a full hearing on the custody and property issues as soon as possible. Agreed, Rebecca said calmly. I welcome the opportunity to present all the facts in a proper legal forum. As the three men prepared to leave, Sheriff Coleman approached Rebecca privately. Ma'am, I have to say, you've handled this situation with more composure than most. Folks would have managed, but you need to understand, the legal system isn't always friendly to women in your position. Are you sure you want to fight this battle? Rebecca looked at David, sleeping peacefully despite the tension that had filled the soddy. Sheriff, 3 weeks ago I would have been terrified by this conversation. I would have submitted to whatever my husband demanded because I thought I had no choice. She met his eyes steadily. But I've learned something important since then. I do have choices, and I choose to fight for the kind of life I want my son to inherit. Sheriff Coleman nodded with something that might have been respect. Well then, Ma'am, I wish you luck. You're going to need it. After the men left, Rebecca sat by the fire and reflected on what had just occurred. She had faced down her husband, his lawyer, and the full weight of legal authority with nothing but preparation, documentation, and unshakable resolve. More importantly, she had demonstrated to herself that she could function as an independent agent in a system designed to keep women dependent. The battle was far from over. Thomas would undoubtedly escalate his efforts, and the community's reaction to her defiance was still uncertain. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Rebecca felt genuinely confident about her chances. She had built something that could withstand legal challenges and social pressure, a foundation of competence, alliance, and moral authority that no one could simply dismiss or override. As evening fell and she prepared David for sleep, Rebecca thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. It had begun with a blizzard that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. It had continued with the unexpected appearance of a man who showed her what genuine respect looked like, and now it was culminating in her transformation from dependent wife to independent woman, from victim of circumstances to architect of her own destiny. The woman who had once waited passively for rescue was gone forever. In her place stood someone who created her own safety, built her own alliances, and fought her own battles. Rebecca Morrison had found her voice, and she intended to use it to speak her truth, regardless of who might prefer her silence. The formal hearing would come soon enough, and with it the final test of everything she had built. But tonight, in the warmth of her own home with her son safe in her arms, Rebecca allowed herself to believe that she was going to win. Not because the law favored her, it didn't, but because she had become someone who deserved to win and was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that victory. The future she was building would be worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and uncertainty. David would grow up knowing that his mother had chosen courage over comfort, independence over security, truth over convenient lies. That legacy, Rebecca was certain, would serve him well in whatever challenges lay ahead. 5 years later, Rebecca Morrison stood on the porch of her expanded homestead, watching the sun set over the Nebraska prairie while her son David played in the yard with 3 other children whose births she had attended. The soddy had been replaced by a proper frame house with 4 rooms and a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning light. Behind the house stood a new barn, a chicken coop, and a garden that supplied vegetables to half the county. The transformation was remarkable, but it paled beside the changes in Rebecca herself. The woman who now managed one of the most prosperous homesteads in the territory bore little resemblance to the frightened wife who had once cowered in a hole in the ground. Her hands were steady and sure as she worked, her voice carried authority when she spoke, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for everything she possessed and won. At 28, Rebecca had become something the frontier had rarely seen before, a completely independent woman who answered to no one but herself and her conscience. The legal battle with Thomas had lasted 8 months and had become the talk of 3 counties. The formal hearing, when it finally occurred, had drawn spectators from as far as North Platte, all eager to see whether a woman could successfully defend her right to independence. Rebecca's meticulous preparation had paid off spectacularly. Witness after witness testified to Thomas's abandonment, his accusations, and his attempts to control property that legally belonged to both spouses. The turning point had come when Dr. Westfield took the stand to defend Swift Arrow's medical intervention. His calm, professional testimony about the Comanche healer's skills had demolished Thomas's claims about Rebecca's poor judgment. When Ezra Hutchins followed with his account of Thomas's behavior on the night he returned, painting a picture of a man more concerned with racial prejudice than his wife's welfare, the judge's sympathies had clearly shifted. But it was Rebecca's own testimony that had sealed the victory. Speaking clearly and without emotion, she had recounted not just the events of that terrible winter, but her gradual realization that she deserved better than a marriage based on control and suspicion. Her words had carried such conviction that even some of Thomas's supporters had begun to nod in agreement. The judge's ruling had been historic. Not only had he granted Rebecca full custody of David and control of the homestead, but he had also awarded her damages for Thomas's abandonment and defamation. More importantly, his written opinion had established legal precedents that other women throughout the territory could use to defend their own rights. Rebecca Morrison's case had become a landmark in frontier law. Thomas had left the territory immediately after the ruling, taking his anger and his lawyer back to Kansas. Rebecca had heard rumors that he had remarried quickly, finding a more compliant wife who would not challenge his authority. She felt no bitterness about his departure, only relief that David would grow up without the influence of a father who saw women as property rather than partners. The homestead had flourished under Rebecca's management in ways it never had under Thomas's control. She had diversified beyond simple farming, establishing herself as the region's most skilled midwife and medical practitioner. Her reputation for successful deliveries had spread throughout the territory, and hardly a month passed without someone riding to her door seeking help with a difficult birth or medical emergency. The skills she had learned from Swift Arrow during those crucial days had proven invaluable. His lessons in reading the signs of labor, managing complications, and maintaining calm under pressure had saved dozens of lives over the years. Rebecca had built on that foundation, corresponding with physicians in Omaha and Denver, studying medical texts and developing techniques that combined the best of modern medicine with traditional healing wisdom. Her success had brought more than just financial security. It had given her something Thomas had never provided, respect from her community based on her own achievements rather than her relationship to a man. Farmers and ranchers who had once dismissed her as Morrison's wife now sought her out as Rebecca the Healer, someone whose judgment could mean the difference between life and death for their families. The house itself had become a symbol of her independence. Built with money she had earned through her medical practice, it represented everything she had achieved through her own efforts. The kitchen was equipped with the latest medical supplies, the parlor served as a consultation room, and the back bedroom was always ready for patients who needed extended care. It was more than a home. It was the headquarters of a thriving practice that served the needs of an entire region. David, now 5 years old, had grown into a sturdy, intelligent boy who bore little resemblance to his absent father. His dark hair and serious demeanor reminded Rebecca more of Swift Arrow than Thomas, though she kept that observation to herself. The child had inherited her determination and independence, already showing signs of the strong will that would serve him well in life. Most importantly, David was growing up with a completely different understanding of relationships between men and women. He saw his mother as a capable leader rather than a dependent follower, and he was learning to value competence and character over gender roles. The lesson would serve him well in a world that was slowly changing to accommodate strong women like his mother. The transformation had not come without costs. Some of the more traditional families in the area still viewed Rebecca with suspicion, uncomfortable with her success and independence. A few women resented her refusal to conform to expected patterns of behavior, seeing her example as an implicit criticism of their own choices. But these voices were increasingly outnumbered by those who appreciated what she had accomplished. More difficult to bear was the loneliness that sometimes accompanied her independence. There had been opportunities for companionship over the years, decent men who admired her strength and would have been honored to share her life. But Rebecca had become cautious about surrendering any portion of the autonomy she had fought so hard to achieve. The memory of what marriage had cost her the first time made her reluctant to risk it again. That was changing, however, as she grew more confident in her ability to maintain her independence regardless of circumstances. Recently, she had been spending time with Dr. Samuel Patterson, a young physician who had established a practice in the growing town of Kearney. Unlike Thomas, Samuel saw her medical skills as an asset rather than a threat, and he spoke of partnership rather than possession when he discussed their potential future together. The prospect of remarriage was becoming more appealing as Rebecca realized that she could choose a very different kind of relationship the second time around. With her financial independence secured and her reputation established, she could afford to marry for love and companionship rather than security and social convention. The difference was liberating. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment and possibility. It had begun with abandonment and terror, continued through unexpected rescue and gradual awakening, and culminated in a hard-fought victory that had transformed not just her own life, but the legal landscape for women throughout the territory. Role that Swift Arrow had played in her transformation could not be overstated. His appearance during her darkest hour had done more than simply save her life. It had shown her what respectful treatment looked like and given her the confidence to demand it from everyone else in her life. His example of quiet dignity and competence had become a standard against which she measured all subsequent relationships. She often wondered what had become of him in the years since their paths had crossed. The Comanche had been increasingly pressured by military campaigns and forced relocations, and many of the bands that had once roamed freely across the plains had been confined to reservations far to the south. Whether Swift Arrow had been caught up in these changes or had somehow managed to maintain his independence, she had no way of knowing, but his influence on her life continued to grow with each passing year. Every successful delivery she attended was a testament to the skills he had taught her. Every stand she took for women's rights drew strength from the example of dignity he had provided. Every choice she made to value character over convention reflected the lesson he had embodied, that humanity transcended the artificial boundaries people drew between themselves and others. David, playing in the yard with his friends, represented the most tangible legacy of that transformative encounter. He was growing up in a world where racial prejudice and gender limitations were being challenged by people like his mother, who refused to accept that things had to remain as they had always been. The boy would inherit not just Rebecca's independence and determination, but also the broader vision of human possibility that Swift Arrow had helped to plant. As evening approached and the children's play grew more subdued, Rebecca began planning for the future with the same methodical care that had carried her through the legal battles and business challenges of the past 5 years. There were new goals to pursue, new obstacles to overcome, new contributions to make to the evolving society around her. She was in correspondence with women's rights activists in Denver and San Francisco, sharing her experiences and learning from others who were fighting similar battles. Her legal victory was being cited in cases throughout the West, helping other women establish their rights to independence and self-determination. The precedent she had set was becoming a tool for liberation that extended far beyond her own situation. Closer to home, she was planning to establish a formal training program for midwives and medical assistants. Too many women in the territory still lacked access to skilled care during childbirth, and too many relied on outdated traditions that sometimes did more harm than good. Rebecca envisioned a network of trained practitioners who could bring both modern medical knowledge and time-tested wisdom to isolated homesteads throughout the region. The program would be revolutionary in its inclusiveness. Unlike medical schools that excluded women and minorities, Rebecca's training would be open to anyone who demonstrated aptitude and dedication, regardless of gender or race. She had learned too much from Swift Arrow to perpetuate the kind of discrimination that might prevent other healers from sharing their knowledge. The financial success of her practice was making these larger ambitions possible. She had accumulated enough capital to invest in equipment, supplies, and facilities that would support a proper training program. More importantly, she had built the reputation and relationships necessary to gain support from progressive physicians and political leaders who shared her vision of expanded medical care. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca called David inside for his evening meal. The routine of daily life continued, but it was enriched by the knowledge that each day brought new opportunities to build something lasting and meaningful. She was no longer simply surviving or even just thriving. She was creating institutions and precedents that would benefit generations of women who came after her. The boy who had been born in a blizzard with the help of a Comanche healer was growing up to understand that his mother's story was part of a larger narrative of human progress and possibility. He would carry that story forward, along with the values it embodied, into a future that was brighter because of the courage his mother had found in her darkest hour. That night, as she tucked David into bed in his comfortable room in their prosperous house, Rebecca whispered the same prayer of gratitude she had offered every night for 5 years. It was addressed not to the distant God of her childhood, but to the very present spirit of a Comanche warrior who had chosen to preserve life rather than take it, to build bridges rather than tear them down, to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. Swift Arrow had given her more than medical assistance during those 4 crucial days. He had given her a vision of what human relationships could be when they were based on respect rather than power, understanding rather than prejudice, cooperation rather than domination. That vision had become the foundation for everything she had built since, and it would continue to guide her as she reached for even greater achievements in the years to come. The woman who had once been left to die in a blizzard had not merely survived. She had transformed her suffering into strength, her isolation into independence, her vulnerability into unshakable determination. Rebecca Morrison had become living proof that the human spirit could triumph over any obstacle, that individual courage could change entire communities, and that love really was stronger than hate when it was coupled with the will to fight for what was right. As sleep claimed her in her warm, secure home, surrounded by the evidence of her success, Rebecca dreamed of the future she was building for David and all the children who would benefit from her example. It was a future where women could choose their own paths, where different races could learn from each other, where strength was measured by character rather than convention. It was a future worthy of the price she had paid to achieve it, and worthy of the gentle warrior who had helped her find the courage to claim it as her own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.